First Amendment at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I'm speaking in my individual capacity today as a scholar. I'll begin with a few announcements before I introduce my esteemed colleague, Steve Levitsky. So first, the Ash Center acknowledges the land on which the Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. Second, today's discussion is being recorded. You will receive a link to that recording in an email following the conclusion of the event, and you'll also be able to find it on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. We'll reserve some time to respond to questions from you, the audience, and you can submit them anytime via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So today's event is really motivated by the fact that a couple of weeks ago, Professor Levitsky and I were part of a discussion with our colleagues Marshall Gans and Cornell Brooks about what we know about democratic backsliding and how to stop it. And during that conversation, we engaged in some back and forth about whether or not mobilization against the first Trump administration's policies during his first administration had been successful or not. And we also began to scratch the surface about what might be required should the United States careen more precipitously into authoritarianism. So Professor Levitsky and I recognize that we both wanted to dive deeper into a couple of these really important questions and that maybe we should do so in a conversation together in public. So that's why we're here today, to have this conversation about our impressions of what's happening in the US right now, what we can learn from the first administration, what is different now, and what might be useful for civil society groups and individuals to consider as ways to defend, renew, and improve democracy under these conditions. So I'm delighted to introduce my colleague, Stephen Levitsky, who is the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and Professor of Government and Director of the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. He is a Senior Fellow at the Kettering Foundation and a Senior Democracy Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism, political parties, and weak and informal institutions, with a focus on Latin America. He is co-author with Dan Ziblatt of How Democracies Die, which was a New York Times bestseller and was published in 30 languages, and more recently the book Tyranny of the Minority: Why American Democracy Reached the Breaking Point. So Steve, you and I are just going to have a conversation, but I'm going to just start us off by asking a couple of questions for us to kick it off. And I think one of the big questions that I've been asked recently so many times is the question of where exactly are we in the United States? So how would we know if we are still a democracy? How would we know if we had crossed into what you call competitive authoritarianism? How would we know if we were further along than that into some other kind of authoritarian system? And do you have good reference points or comparison sets that you think would be useful in helping people wrap their minds around that?
So those are tough questions, particularly when it comes to competitive authoritarianism, because in unlike kind of traditional dictatorships, single party dictatorships or military dictatorships, competitive authoritarian regimes, at least from at first glance, look pretty democratic. The Constitution remains intact. The opposition is legal and above ground. There continue to be competitive elections. And so you've got to look closely to really assess whether we cross the line. Now, you asked, how would we know if we were beyond competitive authoritarianism and something worse? I would say that's a little easier if existing institutions, particularly elections, can't be used to remove the government, then you're in something worse than competitive authoritarianism. If elections are no longer meaningful, and the opposition the incumbent can't be removed via elections, then we're in an outright good old school dictatorship. I think we're not there. But figuring out how, when and where the line is between democracy, which always includes, all democracies have occasional abuse of power. That's single abuse of power is not enough to classify something as competitive authoritarian. How do you know when you've crossed the line? I've been thinking a lot about this because that's an important question for all of us to ask these days. And where I've been thinking recently is about the cost of public opposition. In a democracy, it should not be costly or risky for an individual to write an article, publish an article criticizing the government, join a protest against the government, providing its legal, peaceful protest, should not pay a price for giving money to an opposition party, working for an opposition candidate. In a democracy, those things should be normal, should be costless. Nobody should think twice about the decision to give money to an opposition candidate or attend a peaceful protest. In an authoritarian regime, opposition is invariably costly and risky. There is you pay some price for publicly aligning yourself with the opposition or publicly criticizing the government. Now, in most competitive authoritarian regimes, that price is not death or lifetime imprisonment or exile, but there are prices. Will donors to the Democratic Party be investigated and targeted by the IRS? Many donors fear that that is the case. If you're a law firm that worked with either the Democratic Party or civil society organizations that have opposed Trump, will you be blackballed and possibly driven into bankruptcy? If you're a university that is considered to be left of center or politically tilted towards the opposition, will you be targeted by massive funding cuts? If you're an independent media outlet, will you be targeted with a defamation lawsuit, or will your parent company receive adverse regulatory rulings? If you're a Republican lawmaker, will you face death threats if you get in the crosshairs of President Trump? The answer to all of those questions today, just 10 weeks into the Trump presidency, is yeah, quite plausibly. And so to me, that is when you see people across civil society, leaders of organizations, university presidents, CEOs, editors of newspapers, maybe church leaders, politicians on both sides of the aisle, donors, political, people who give money to political organizations, when they are worrying, thinking twice about normal, peaceful acts of opposition because they know or believe that there's a risk of government retribution attached to that behavior, then you know you've probably crossed the line. And I actually think we crossed that line pretty quickly in 2025.
Yeah. So I want to ask and just talk through like one of the really interesting complexities that your framework raises, which I think is the idea that you'll face costs from the government if you say things that that anger Trump or Musk or whoever. At the same time, one of the conversations that people have had about, say, the First Amendment, right, is that the First Amendment protects speech from government's arbitrary, intrusion on their lives or whatever, but it doesn't protect them from the consequences of, the social consequences of saying some things that might, be unpopular or might generate backlash socially and things along those lines. And so, I wanted to talk a little bit about the role of informal institutions here, because on the one hand, it does feel like there is, significant government cost to public opposition in the manner in which you raised. But it almost feels also that there's significant cost by informal actors, right, that are aligned with or favor the government. This is like when you get into the questions about paramilitary organizations, when you get into questions about, groups that just would, troll armies and other groups that are not the government, but make also the social costs of opposition so high that people are trying to stay out of harm's way there too, and that there's no attempt, by the government to potentially be aggressive or assertive and trying to bring people to accountability who are silencing. Right. Okay. Got you. So informal actors who are imposing costs also are in like a lawless environment in which they can get away with that, is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yes, I think in an authoritarian regime, the state gets weaponized. Agencies of the government, from the DOJ, the FBI, to the IRS, to the Department of Education, as it turns out, to many, many different agencies of government get purged, get packed with government loyalists, and then get deployed to target opponents, to either punish rivals or to bully members of civil society into silence, into submission, into compliance.
Mm-hmm.
And but the other way in which a weaponized state works, it works as a weapon, but it also works as a shield. So a loyalist DOJ or loyalist prosecutors can and often do turn a blind eye to illegal, authoritarian, or violent acts by government allies. Those
Right.
government allies, as you point out, may be private. They're not state actors. But if they are encouraged, tolerated, or protected by the state, by a weaponized state, that is that's a state abuse, and that is authoritarian.
Yeah.
This happened, in a widespread way, as you know very well, in the Jim Crow South, right? There were it was mostly private militias, many of them linked to the Democratic Party,
Mm-hmm.
that engaged in widespread terror and voter intimidation and vote fraud across the U.S. South, but they did it because they were protected. The local authorities,
Mm-hmm.
state authorities, sometimes even federal authorities, turned a blind eye to their behavior. So that is equally authoritarian.
Yeah. So the key takeaways here are, on the one hand, we're in competitive authoritarianism because of the weaponization of state agencies and attempts to sort of bully the opposition to the sidelines, as you put it before, and that we would know if we were further along than that if elections no longer serve as ways to actually change who the incumbent party is, like if they're just meaningless. So I think those are very useful, and as we've talked about before, there are very few bright lines between a lot of these different categories. But I actually think those are some really useful frameworks for people with some concrete kind of implications to make sense of what they're seeing. And they obviously also raise questions about like where signs of life are, like what are the still democratic elements of this situation we're in. I wanted to point to just a few of them. So one of them is that protest is actually on the rise in the U.S. My team at the Crowd Counting Consortium just today was able to sort of put out some data that shows that the number of protests between February and March grew by like 60%. They've happened in all 50 states in the last month. Very large turnout or increasing turnout happening. There are interesting kind of creative techniques of economic non-cooperation, boycotts of businesses that are too closely aligned with Trump and his policies, or with Elon Musk in particular, and that those actually show like an energized and motivated civil society, at least at the grassroots level, and some creativity left for a pro-democratic fight. The second sign of life is, of course, voters and voters turning out in competitive elections, including the one that happened in Wisconsin around the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court judge that happened this last week, where she was able to defeat a Musk and Trump-backed candidate with like the most expensive judicial race in American history. The third is the press. That even though some have critiqued some of the sort of establishment legacy press for soft peddling description of what's happening and maybe being too closely aligned with Trump, we still do have an independent, free press and a press that can report on what's going on and get the facts out. And then the fourth is civil society institutions, which are beginning to push back. And some universities have come out even preemptively with now statements, underscoring their core values, the importance of their independence and autonomy, and their refusal to sort of give up on those. Some of the law firms that have been targeted by EOs have kind of come back and said, we'll see you in court and we're suing. So you are seeing that there is some pushback, at least to some of these early executive orders. And of course, the absolute torrent of lawsuits, right? So beyond universities and and law firms. We're seeing all kinds of different groups come together and actually sue against EOs that affect them and their constituencies. And I think all of these are important sources of energy and parallel power. And then there's sort of structural things that work in the US's favor, like the length of which it's been a democracy, and its wealth. And, in our field, there's a lot of people who say that we've never seen a country this wealthy and this long with an experience of democracy collapse. So, that doesn't mean it couldn't happen and go all the way, but those are some signs of life. And so I wonder what you make of that. Just that that we do have many elements of democracy. We have many kind of predictive models that would suggest that the United States will survive this and climb out of this one way or the other. And you certainly hear a lot of people assuming that will happen, or at least being optimistic that will happen, particularly in more establishment kind of institutions. So I'm just curious what you make of that.
I think all of that is right. U.S. democracy is hard to kill. It's harder to kill than all of the comparative cases that we talk about. It's considerably harder to kill than democracy in Hungary or Venezuela or Philippines or Tunisia or El Salvador or Turkey. Mm-hmm. Not only because it's, I think we can exaggerate how old U.S. democracy is.
Indeed.
By my count, it's only been a fully democratic regime since 1965.
Yep.
But the wealth in this country does matter. I mean, I think one I guess thing I would add is the United States has a very muscular civil society. We have, without question, the muscle to push back on Trump. Mm-hmm. I mean that in multiple senses, and you know this much better than I do. But first of all, we have a really big, really diverse, really wealthy private sector. Mm. And I was as appalled as everybody else at the reaction of Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg et al. To Trump's victory, but there's still 750 other billionaires out there. Mm. We have 22 million millionaires in the United States. Mm. There's a lot of money out there. Even if 90% of them sell out, and they might, there's still a lot of people with a lot of money able to fund civil society, able to fund media projects, able to fund organizations with lawyers, which is what we need maybe more than anything right now, and able to fund opposition candidates. So there's a lot of wealth in our society, and that does matter. Our civil society is also very well organized. We have a very large number of civic organizations, of foundations, of well-endowed universities. The institutional capacity to teach, to organize, to mobilize, to coordinate, to oppose authoritarianism is really quite high in the United States, much higher than any backsliding case that you can name. And the other advantage, not unrelated, is that the Trump administration and the Trump project is not very popular. I mean, it did win the popular vote in Trump did win the popular vote in the election. That's true, but the authoritarians who do the most damage are those who are able to build 70-80% public support. And you see that in El Salvador, Venezuela, Turkey, India, Hungary, a little bit lower, but we're very popular. Putin too. Trump almost every day he's been around in American politics, more Americans have opposed him than supported him. That's not a guarantee of anything, but all things equal, that helps a lot. So we have a lot going for us. The key is reacting, is responding, and is pushing back. And what has been surprising to me, that maybe the most surprising thing of the first 3 months of this presidency is, despite the number of protests which you point to, and that's really important to be aware of, in general, the sort of upper tiers of our civil society, our political establishment, our CEOs, our media, our national media outlets, our universities, largely have not pushed back. They've been pretty silent.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about this. And I appreciate and agree with your point that we have all of the ingredients and all of the capacity for what an effective pro-democratic, meaning small d democratic civil society mobilization would look like to reverse this backsliding. I agree with that. What we're seem to be missing is a will and a plan. And so, when we think about like what happened during Trump's first administration versus today's, I think that there are some really interesting and important points of comparison. So when he first won, it was like a shock win. I think he and the people around him were as surprised as a lot of other people that he won. There was no real plan and platform. By now, he hadn't even confirmed a lot of key people in the administration. A bunch of people had already been sacked, and there was like mostly a lot of leaks and palace intrigue by this point. Um, he didn't have complete control over the bureaucracy in any meaningful sense. And there was a lot of immediate and extremely moving kind of protest. We had the Women's March, the largest single-day demonstration in U.S. history, the day after he was inaugurated. And I think that catalyzed people to get involved in organizing in their communities, largely funneling into like individual groups and groups like that, where they found kind of political homes that were honestly quite novel for a lot of people, because they had never before kind of been activated in this sense. They found a political home. And then Indivisible gave them stuff to do, which was, okay, you're going to call your congresspeople. Here's the script, and we're going to make sure that the ACA stays alive after this, first budget bill, et cetera. And so there were two really big, important early wins for the pro-democratic opposition by this point in its life under the first Trump administration. The first was that there were that actually when Trump released the so-called Muslim ban, which was the EO that was restricting entry for people who were from majority Muslim countries, and you had people who are coming in on planes, who are going to then be, detained at the border. There was a very large-scale mobilization, rapid mobilization. People were going to airports, and then legal challenges were issued. And I'm not sure if folks remember this, but the outcome of all of that was that the administration withdrew that EO, right? So they rescinded it. They later put it out again and withdrew it again from legal challenge, and then it brought it back a third time a while later. That was much more narrow, and that passed through the Supreme Court. But it was actually like popular pressure and the legal impossibility of it was enough to get themselves to rescind it. And that was in February of 2017. And then by March, there were like major political victories around like, not yet fully MAGA Republicans who were still in the House, basically taking these town halls and these phone calls and saying, I don't want to kill the ACA. That was like very unpopular. And so, by now there had been some like major organizing and kind of political wins. And then, all the way through to 2020, there was so many kind of major episodes of pushing back. But by 2020, the level of civil society proactive mobilization to avoid Trump from staying in office if he lost the election, in other words, the sort of anti-coup mobilization of the fall of 2020, was significant. And as you said, like key institutions, including Harvard, the president at the time was Larry Bacow, and he and all 12 deans of Harvard released a statement standing up for democracy. And all living secretaries of defense signed a letter that was organized by my former late colleague, Ash Carter, saying that the military does not determine the outcomes of elections, because Trump had been basically suggesting at that time that the military would be with him, right, if he decided to stay in power. They released that letter on January 3rd of 2021. So this is like major civil society pushback on anti-democratic action. So let me just say a little bit. I want to return to what was successful about that and us talk about that a little bit. But before I do, I just want to like lay out what I see as some descriptive comparisons with where we are now, which is, first of all, it's not a shock. It wasn't a shock that he won. And so there wasn't this sort of immediate and overwhelming need to demonstrate symbolic resistance to it. Instead, there was a sense of deflation that enough Americans could see season one and want it again, that it was just like depressing for a lot of people. And then the second is that he also expected to win and had a plan. He had Project 2025. He had people he knew he was going to nominate for confirmations, and he knew he was going to get those confirmations approved. He has now total control over MAGA. The MAGA has total control of the GOP, I should say. So there aren't like going to be defectors in the House GOP in the manner in which there would be in 2017. He's got Elon Musk in there accessing data, which could allow for much more sophisticated abuses of the kind that you mentioned, and that's scaring people. The opposition seems kind of weak to sympathizers or uninteresting to people and easy to demonize. The Democratic base is quite unhappy with the Democratic Party and outraged by what the GOP is doing. As you mentioned, a lot of civil society institutions are kind of either immobilized or acquiescent. And the underlying sentiment, it feels like, is that people are just genuinely terrified of what looks like a revenge tour. And so are just trying to stay out of harm's way, right? And the sort of muzzle velocity aspect of it. So I think like the political conditions are certainly different now than they were in early 2017. But that doesn't mean we can't learn things from what was effective during season one. So you've mentioned before on our last webinar, you were talking about how you actually thought that resistance under the first Trump administration was successful. And I wanted to hear you say a little bit more about why you thought that's true, like what about it was successful and why you thought it worked.
Sure. I don't have too much to add beyond what your really compelling description of the first 3 months of 2017 and the early victories that were achieved. Let me just, before I jump into that, add a couple of things to the mix in terms of understanding the differences in reaction.
Great.
There were a couple of psychological reactions, collective psychological reactions that I think proved to be really problematic. One, the fact that Trump won the popular vote, something that he'd never done before. This was not a massive electoral shift, but he won the popular vote. That was surprising. And that was very legitimizing.
Right.
It empowered Trump and his supporters to a great degree, and it was extraordinarily deflating to Democrats.
Yeah.
And led to a sense of sort of resignation and demoralization for several months that kind of left the entire opposition on a very weak footing as we began in early 2025. And even the media, the establishment media, I mean, the fact that the New York Times once wrote about Trump's sweeping electoral victory in November. The guy won by 1.5 percentage points.
Right. It's not exactly a mandate.
But the establishment media was very affected by the legitimacy that was conferred by that popular vote victories. That was the one factor. The other one is I don't know how to explain this, but the vast bulk of the U.S. establishment, I'm talking about politicians, certainly donors and business people, and the media, the conventional wisdom among them as late as December was that it was not going to be that bad. That we survived. We kind of gloss over January 6th, and we look back at the first Trump presidency, and he didn't achieve very much. And we eventually defeated him, and he eventually left office. We survived Trump 1.0, So yeah, we'll survive Trump 2.0.
Yeah.
Um, it's it was shocking to me at the time. I think it's shocking to most of us in retrospect, but that was the dominant view.
Hmm.
That, we muddle through the first one, we'll muddle through it again. And you very nicely pointed out the very, very important differences between now and then, in particular, the level of constraint that Trump faced
Hmm.
in the first term, all of which has been removed this time around. There's no constraints in his cabinet. He has no constraints in the legislature. So he's able to. Trump has always had authoritarian instincts, and
Hmm.
that was visible from the beginning of his presidency. But he's able to act on those authoritarian instincts, and he has a team with him, as you said, with a plan
Yeah.
to weaponize the state and deploy it against the opposition that was just not there the first time. So look, I mean, I don't have a ton to say. I was very the reason we began talking about this is I was really perturbed, I guess, by the another conventional wisdom that we started
Hmm.
hearing after the election, which is the resistance failed the first time around. So that the small d Democrats are gonna have to come up with something else.
Yeah.
And I was just blown away by that because I can't, as a political scientist who studies regimes, I can't think of an indicator that would show me that the resistance failed. So I don't study protests and I don't know much about either causes or consequences of it. But as you pointed out, some of Trump's early abuses, some of his worst, most egregious abuses were blocked in no small part because of public protest.
Yeah.
The As a mainstream political scientist, I look at things like election outcomes.
Yeah.
The 2018 election was a major victory for the opposition, and Trump was defeated in the 2020 election and eventually removed from power.
Yeah.
So in the first two electoral opportunities that the opposition got, the opposition won big and turned an autocrat out of power, which is no small thing. So the most egregious abuses were blocked.
Hmm.
Trump was unable to really seriously weaponize the state and consolidate power, and he was thrown out of power via elections as quickly as was constitutionally possible. That strikes me as extraordinarily successful.
Yep. That's right. And as you mentioned, we have, pretty good studies that show that it was actually things like protest and turnout at protest that could be linked to the election outcomes in 2018 and the election outcome of 2020. So there are papers out now that show that protest size at the Women's March in 2017 was really strongly correlated with an increase in the diversity of people who ran for office, and which created the most diverse Congress in U.S. history in 2018 after the 2018 election. It also
Brought some very
had
good politicians into the Congress.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And some of them who are leading now, right, on the opposition side. The second is that it also in 2020, the summer of 2020, which was the broadest based mass mobilization in U.S. history after the killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, are correlated strongly with increases in vote choice, or votes for Biden than for Trump. That came out in a paper a couple of weeks ago. So and then there's indicators that show changes in public opinion about policing and about racism. There's also changes in policing behavior that can be observed from those protests, and that's not unique to the Trump administration. It's often the case, as we know from research by Dan Gillian and Omar Wassow and others, that what you might call pro-democratic or small, d-democratic protests and turnout at protests is strongly correlated with more positive or electoral results later, from the civil rights onward movement onward. So, so I think it's really important for people to know that that it isn't all about the elections. What we do between elections is incredibly important. Elections are super important, but they're one mechanism through which civil society pushes back on democratic backsliding. And in fact, a mobilized and prepared civil society is what is associated ultimately, or one of the things that can be strongly associated with electoral outcomes that that tip the balance back into a more democratic, small d democratic direction. I wanted to talk a little bit too about why it is that people sometimes assume that resistance during the first Trump administration didn't succeed, and then we'll turn to some audience Q&A. So my read on this is that some people, the critique comes from people suggesting that the resistance wasn't able to consolidate power and move the country into a more pro-democratic frame of mind over the long term. This is not unique to the United States. Actually, over the last many number of years, this is something that was almost like universal. And a lot of the so-called like color revolutions or people power movements of the last 15 years, where you see in Egypt in 2011, there's a strong, what you would call negative coalition trying to get Morsi out after in Tunisia, they're getting Ben Ali out. And that's a strong negative coalition of like throw the guy out. And you could argue that that was what was going on in the fall of 2020. Just throw the guy out, right, and protect the results. And then what happens is that if it doesn't actually transfer into something that's more of a positive coalition, which is, and here is an amazing and totally attractive and irresistible vision for the future of the country that is going to bring people along, that it just makes the short-term victory extremely fragile and vulnerable to what effectively is a counter-revolution. Or a return to the Ancien regime. So this happened in Egypt in 2013. It happened in Tunisia in 2022. Sudan had a big breakthrough moment in 2019. Same thing happens in 2021. And those were in countries that were really consolidated autocracies that had their democratic breakthrough moment, but then had a major backsliding episode or a coup. So, those are more extreme examples, but what happened in the United States was a coup attempt that was thwarted by a pro-democratic coalition. And the sort of project of Bidenomics, I think, was trying to express that positive coalition, and it didn't sell, or it didn't work somehow. And so I wanted to talk to you about, whether you see this formulation of a positive-negative coalition problem as part of the diagnosis for that, or it and what that sort of tells us about what needs to happen going forward, because it's one way of looking at what happened. It's not the only way of looking at what happened. But if that is a diagnosis, then it does have implications for what a pro-democratic coalition needs to be doing now, if it wants to make sure not to win in the short term and lose in the long term again.
Yeah, I share a lot of that diagnosis.
Okay.
I think that, I mean, the other reason why we tend to think that the resistance failed, which is closely related to what you said, is that Trump came back. We
Yeah.
expected Trumpism to go away, and that would have been success. But that's a big ask, and it's just not terribly realistic. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, my view. Let me see if I can articulate it clearly. I think negative or defensive coalitions are incredibly important. And even necessary.
Yeah.
That is in many, if not probably most cases, if you don't form that coalition, a broad-based coalition among people who really don't necessarily share a lot of interests, don't have very different views on a bunch of different matters, but who are united in their opposition to this authoritarian government. If you don't mobilize a big part of that coalition,
Yeah.
you're not going to win, and you run
Yep.
the risk of failing to remove the autocrats. So, I embrace negative coalitions. I think they're great. They're really important, and they're always necessary. You can never live without them. That said, you are right. If we really want to, defending democracy amid crises is a long game. It's a hard struggle. We wish for happy endings where we get rid of the bad guy once and we can wash our hands and we're done.
Mm,
it's rarely that easy.
mm,
And many democracies, usually not as wealthy and well endowed as the United States, but many of them go through decades of back and forth of sort of
mm.
sliding between not very functional democracies and then weak authoritarians, and then they stop the authoritarian, but they're not able to reconsolidate democracy. This can go on for a while because it's
Yeah.
hard to build a positive coalition. It's hard to build a new model. Um, I agree that we would. So I guess my caution is we should never neglect the work of building the negative coalition just because we haven't figured out the positive one.
Yeah.
Because the negative coalition gives us a fighting chance.
Yeah.
We may only be 4 years and we may fail,
Mm,
but we still have to have that opportunity to experiment and build the positive coalition. Biden tried. I agree with you. It didn't work.
mhm.
Um, I don't think I don't think we fully understand why it didn't work, but it didn't work.
Yeah.
Um, I think that very broadly speaking, the center left and even liberalism extending all the way to the center right in Western democracies is in a crisis. It doesn't really have a project,
Mm,
right? The center left had the sort of New Deal social democratic project in the West for many decades, then shifted in the Clinton Blair era into a sort of a more centrist liberalism, and in the 21st century, um, stands for not much more than a kind of defense of the Obama status quo, and that's not enough. It's not enough. It's enough to reconstruct a negative coalition and win an election.
mhm.
But as we saw in the last social democratic government in Germany, as we're seeing today in the Labour government in Britain, as we saw with Biden, it's just not enough. And so a critical task, this is not my job. This is mostly going to be experimentation among, I think, politicians.
Mhm.
But it's a critical task, really, of the center left across the democratic world to come up with a project that can be the sort of the policy and ideological foundation of that positive coalition. I don't think we're very close.
Mhm.
I think we'll get there, but it's going to involve experimentation. And if I had any clue what the recipe was, I would have a much better paying job.
Yeah, I mean, somebody asked us earlier about what are the mistakes that could be made right now by civil society in this moment, and the most important mistake to avoid is just not getting information. And right now, getting information looks like building the negative coalition. Starting there is a good start, right? Um, so we're going to move into kind of the Q&A portion. Some of these questions have been submitted before and have been sort of repeated in the Q&A and the Zoom. But the most common one that I'm hearing right now, other than where are we and what's happening in this country, is what can we do about it? Like, what can individual constituents do about it? And I'm really curious about your answer, and then I'm going to answer it quickly myself.
Okay, well, I'm curious to hear your answer because you're the expert on this. I am not. I'm going to give you
Okay.
the answer that I give to people, which is it's not a very sexy one at all. Um, but I believe it intensely, which is that there are 1,000 ways to act, maybe
Yeah.
10,000 different ways to act. We and what's important is that you act, and not just online, in face-to-face, in-person social political activity. And the causes are numerous, and I think it's probably most important to embrace the cause that's most meaningful to you. Not you, Erica, but you, the audience. And whatever it is, whether it's deportations or abortion, or the attack on universities and free speech, whatever it is,
Hmm.
find your cause and get involved. And we we don't know which issue and which cause or which protest strategy is going to take off. I'm pretty confident, especially after I talked to Erica, that it is and it will take off. Something will, but we cannot predict what it's going to look like, where it's going to, where where it's going to center, where it's going to begin, which demographic it's going to take off in. We all have to basically be throwing spaghetti at the wall. We all have to try, and it's worth trying in an area that is meaningful to you. But we've all got to be out there. There have to be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people out there doing politics and pushing back. The one thing I know that we can't do is through some combination of fear, exhaustion, and resignation, just give up. That's all I know.
Well, that was an expert answer. I have very little to add, but for those who are curious about the various ways that they could get involved, I would just add to you, don't do it alone. One of the key insights that comes from the field I work in is that there really is power in numbers, and so there's a group called Choose Democracy that has like an interesting menu of sort of like, if you want to do something, what's your passion? What do you think you're willing to do? What are you interested in doing? And then you can click on it and it'll tell you, how you could train to do that thing. Who else is doing it? How would you find them? How would you find them where you live? How can you plug into a campaign? And, Steve is right. I just think this is a moment to not give up. It's a moment to keep the faith and get involved and do it with others and just know you're not alone. The second question that comes up is an interesting one about just meaning making and trying to have more public awareness about how to identify indicators of where we are during a backsliding episode. So it's kind of going back to what we started with, of this question of how do we know where we are. So you gave some, I think, incredibly helpful kind of metrics or frameworks for understanding this. How would we get the word out to the whole public about those?
Well, I always go on your webinars because many people watch them, and so that's one way. Look, I think obviously this is a moment for people who do this stuff for a living, like the two of us, to be spending some time trying to get the word out, speaking to the media in public fora, et cetera. This is not the time to be turning down interviews.
Yeah.
But there's a really important role to be played, I would say, by civil society leaders that so far, and they haven't yet taken up the mantle.
Yeah.
Whether it is, you mentioned Larry Bacow and the 12 deans in just in anticipation of the 2020 election. Harvard's been silent since Trump took office, despite the fact that this Trump 2.0 has been much more authoritarian, much more abusive than the first time around. University leaders, CEOs, media figures, church leaders, union leaders should be people who have a voice that carries a little bit. Very few people listen to Steve Levitsky, but
that's not true.
Not too many. But when the president of Harvard speaks out, that gets attention. And I think it is very, very important that civil society leaders, particularly the upper tiers of civil society, those who have the privilege and the power to have a degree of protection and influence, it's really important that they speak out. They don't have to be political scientists. They can talk to the political scientists, but they need to speak out. And that is one way of getting the word out, much more than just as great as Ash Center webinars are. A much broader array of civil society leaders need to be speaking.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one way
politicians too. Politicians are not speaking out. The Democrats decided they decided it's not electorally beneficial to talk about democracy, so they stopped talking about democracy. Not good.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I was just going to say, I think one of the things that could be useful is this issue of actually maybe a project where people with expertise on this join together with people who are in a position to make a difference and provide them with some very basic popular education that works well to help educate their constituents and their audiences about this as As you mentioned, you and I have audiences, but they're they're more limited than those who are in real positions of power, who actually have constituents and bases and people that they can move, right? So, I think a group of questions is really oriented towards some of the more structural issues that we face as a country, right? So you and I have mostly been focusing on indicators of the health of democracy, as indicators of like how costly is it for people, for ordinary folks to express their opinion without fear of political retribution, et cetera. But then there's also the actual underlying institutions that make people feel either that they are being represented or not, right? And so you've written a book with our colleague Dan Ziblatt about what you call the tyranny of the minority, and the sort of prevalence of minoritarian institutions in the U.S. as something that actually makes us even institutionally less democratic than we otherwise could be when the country is functioning in a sort of normal sense. And can you talk, for those who are not yet familiar and haven't been lucky enough to read your book yet, about some of the things that could be done without, say, amending the Constitution that could make either states or the country as a whole a more healthy democracy in general?
Sure. This is actually a discussion that has been kind of put on the shelf a little bit, be, in part because Trump won the popular vote. So
Yeah.
the discussions about the Electoral College, which is one of those very counter-majoritarian institutions that died down, at least for now. But look, the United States is far and away the most counter-majoritarian democracy in the world. It is the only presidential democracy on earth where the loser of the popular vote can win the presidency. It is the only democracy on earth where a legislative minority can systematically and permanently veto the will of a legislative majority. We're the only established democracy where Supreme Court justices have a lifetime tenure. Every other established democracy has either term limits or a retirement age for Supreme Court justices. So this is a democracy where partisan minorities can systematically thwart partisan majorities
Yeah.
and can sometimes govern over partisan minorities. Let me just quickly recap something that's not always so salient in people's minds. In 2016, the loser of the popular vote won the presidency. And the party that won fewer votes for Senate won control over the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
That president and that Senate, both minoritarian, went on to nominate and confirm 3 Supreme Court justices. So if the United States was like almost every other established democracy in the world, in which those who win more votes win the power, we would have in the United States a 6-3 liberal majority on the Supreme Court today. Imagine what would have happened or would not have happened over the last 5 or 6 years had we had a 6-3 liberal majority on the Supreme Court. That was incredibly consequential.
Yeah.
I don't want to delve too deeply into this. If you want to go down the rabbit hole, buy our book Tyranny, or go to the library and get our book Tyranny of the Minority. But the far right, the sort of ethno-nationalist right, is about 30% of the electorate in most Western democracies. It's nowhere near a majority in any Western democracy. And so the question is, what do our democracies do with that 30%, which is illiberal and potentially authoritarian? Only in the United States has that 30% been able to govern alone, win power and govern alone, because of our electoral system, which is it's kind of a first past the post electoral system. We explain this in detail in the book. We don't have time to get into it now. Because of our two-party system and primaries, if that 30% can win a primary and win control of one of the two parties, it can win and govern the country alone. That has made us much more vulnerable to authoritarianism then I think any country in Europe, the UK is potentially also vulnerable. But in parliamentary democracies with proportional representation systems, like in most of Europe, that 30% can be influential.
Mhm.
It can sometimes be a junior partner in coalition governments, sometimes even a senior partner, like in Italy. But it never governs alone. It governs in coalition, which inevitably dilutes its power and constrains it. So that 30% has done much less damage so far, at least in Europe, than in the United States. The United States has had very progressive institutions compared to other countries when it was founded in the 18th century. But over the course of a couple of centuries, all other established democracies in the world, all the other what we consider old democracies, all of them spent 150 years reforming and dismantling
Mhm.
their most counter-majoritarian institutions. Things like disproportionate senates, things like lifetime tenure on Supreme Courts, things like electoral colleges. Throughout Europe and Latin America, these counter-majoritarian institutions were either weakened or dismantled.
Yep.
But in the United States, we hung on to most of them, not all of them, most of them. And as a result, we've begun from being a relative democratic pioneer
Mm.
in the 18th and early 19th centuries to being a democratic laggard. And that's even before Trump got elected.
Yeah. Well, lots to focus on there in terms of structural reforms. But just because you mentioned first past the post, and since we're running out of time, I might just say that, there's nothing in our Constitution in the US that mandates that we vote that way, right? And there have been interesting experiments, projects, proposals to pass laws that allow us to vote with PR, multi-member
Yeah.
districts. There are proposals to vote ranked choice. There are lots of different ways that we could actually conduct our elections that would be counter-minoritarian. Those are picking up in some states, and we'll see where they go.
We tend to be very small C conservative about our institutions in the United States. We treat the Constitution and even regular electoral rules as things to kind of be observed under glass, not touched and not experimented with. And I think that's really costly.
Mm.
Our democracy, even again before Trump, was facing some serious problems and was losing legitimacy, losing the trust of our citizens. And so we're going to have to experiment with institutional reform. Some will work, some will not work, but we are in great need of democratic experimentation.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, it's been, as usual, a total delight to be in conversation with you. And I want to thank everybody who followed along. And just close by saying that, in every generation, there's a need for new ideas, renewal, both in terms of how we want to govern ourselves and also a commitment to do so. And so I'm really grateful for those that have joined us and those that are continuing to be out there supporting the democratic project.